Okay, so you want to own a medieval watermill. A stone building on a river, a wooden wheel turning in the current, sacks of grain going in one door, and flour coming out the other. Every family in the village walks up your lane once a fortnight, and every one of them leaves a little of what they brought behind. That's the picture. And it's not a stupid picture. For about 400 years, this was one of the most reliable ways to make money in Europe. Stand on the bank of a working mill leat and watch the wheel go round, and it looks like the perfect business. The river does the work. The river never sends an invoice, and the customers have to eat. You look at that and you think, this thing prints money while I sleep. Here's the problem. The wheel is the cheapest part of the whole operation, and the river is the least reliable business partner you will ever have. When William the Conqueror's commissioners went through England in 1086, they counted somewhere around 6,000 mills. By the year 1300, there were closer to 10,000. These were the most expensive machines in the English countryside, and the abbeys and barons who paid for them almost never ran them. They built them, and then they handed the keys to somebody else. So why would the richest institutions in England spend the price of a craftsman's house on a machine and then immediately give it away to a tenant? And why, 300 years later, did the townspeople of St. Albans break into an abbey and tear up the floor over it? The answer is that nobody was really buying a machine at all. Before we go any further, we need to fix the money, because otherwise none of the numbers in this video will mean anything to you. Medieval English money runs on 3 units. A pound is 20 shillings. A shilling is 12 pence, which means 240 pennies to the pound. Now here's the part that makes it real. In the middle of the 14th century, a master mason earned about 4p a day. A master carpenter, 3p. A cow cost somewhere around 6 to 9 shillings. A one-room cottage cost about £2 to build. A craftsman's house, the kind with a workshop attached and a tiled roof, ran 10 to 15 pounds. So when I tell you a piece of equipment cost £2, what I'm telling you is that it cost more than 120 days of skilled labor. Hold that in your head. It's going to matter. Now, there isn't one kind of mill. There are several, and each one is really a different business wearing the same water wheel. The one you're picturing is the Demesne Mill, built by the lord of the manor, owned outright, and roughly 40% of all mills in England. This is the version with teeth, and we'll come back to why. Below that sits the tenant mill. Someone holds it as a customary tenancy, pays a fixed annual rent to the lord, and keeps whatever the mill earns above that, about 1/5 of the total. Lower ceiling, lower risk. Then there's the borough mill, owned by a town corporation rather than a person. Another 1/5, run by committee, which historically has never made anything cheaper. And then there's the 4th category, the one that doesn't appear in anybody's accounts. Domestic milling, a woman on a kitchen floor with a hand mill, grinding a few pounds of barley at a time. Historians estimate that even at the height of the whole system, somewhere around 1/5 of all grain in England was still being ground at home. Remember that number. It is the single most important number in this video, and it took a very long time for anyone to notice it. On top of all that, mills also split by what they grind. Corn mills for bread grain, fulling mills, which pound woolen cloth in water instead of grinding anything, malt mills for brewing, and later, mills driving hammers and bellows for ironwork. Each of these is a different bet on the same underlying question. Are you selling a service that people want, or are you selling the absence of any alternative? Because those two businesses look identical from the outside, and they fail in completely different ways. Right. Let's talk about what it costs to get the wheel turning. Everyone assumes the expensive part of a watermill is the mill, the wheel, the gearing, the stones, the machinery. It isn't, not even close. The largest single investment in a medieval watermill went into the water control system and the foundations. Everything that happens before the water reaches the wheel. Start with the site. You cannot put a mill on a river. You have to put it on a controlled fall of water, And if the river doesn't provide one, you build one. That means a weir across the channel to raise the level upstream. It means a leat, an artificial cut running off the river, sometimes several hundred yards long, dug by hand, lined and banked so it doesn't collapse. It means a mill pond to hold a reserve of water for the days when the flow drops. And it means a tail race to carry the spent water back to the river without flooding your own foundations. That is not carpentry. That is earth moving. And in the 13th century, earth moving means men with shovels and baskets, working for weeks. Now the part nobody budgets for. Every one of those decisions takes water away from somebody else. Raise a weir and you flood the meadow of the man upstream. Divert a leat and you drop the level of the mill downstream. Block the channel and you obstruct the fish, the boats, and the drainage of everyone in the valley. Medieval manorial court records are full of these disputes, and they run for decades, because water rights in a river system are a fixed pie, and a mill is a machine for taking a bigger slice of it. Before you have ground a single grain, you have made enemies of your neighbors in a way that a barn or a bakehouse never would. Then the building. Timber frame on a stone or timber footing, which sounds cheap until you remember it is sitting in permanently wet ground, carrying a rotating mass of several tons. Foundations under a mill fail in a way foundations under a house do not. Then the ironwork, the wheel and gearing are wood, and wood the local carpenter can handle. But the spindle that carries the turning stone, the bearings it runs in, the iron cross called the rind that grips the stone from underneath, all of that has to be forged, and forged accurately. This is blacksmith work at the top of the trade, and unlike the timber, it wears constantly, because it is metal turning on metal under load, all day, for years. And then the stones. A pair of millstones is the single most expensive object in the building, and this is where the whole business stops being local. The most prized stones in England came from France, quarried in the Paris basin, shipped across the Channel, and hauled up from Southampton, or brought inland by river from London. There were German stones too, cut from volcanic rock in the Rhineland. There were cheaper English stones from the Peak District and from Wales. They were not interchangeable. The French stone produced a finer, whiter flour and was worth more to a mill selling into a town market. The English grit left grit in the flour. The German stone left a dark dust that discolored it. So the stone you bought was a direct decision about what quality of flour you were in the business of selling, made once, up front, for years. And millstone prices did not sit still. According to David Farmer's study of manorial accounts across the great English estates, millstone prices roughly doubled between the early 13th century and the Black Death, and then doubled again over the second half of the 14th. Your most expensive consumable more than quadrupled in price across the period when milling was becoming less profitable, not more. Plenty of mills responded exactly how you'd expect. They quietly stopped buying French stones and switched to cheap English ones, and accepted a worse product. Here's the detail that turns all of this from an expense into a trap. Millstones are consumables. The grinding surface of a stone is not flat. It is cut with a pattern of furrows that shear the grain and move the meal outward, and that pattern wears smooth with use. So every few weeks of hard running, a specialist called a millwright arrives with a set of steel chisels and recuts the entire surface by hand. That process is called dressing. Every dressing removes stone. The stone gets thinner. Eventually it gets too thin, and a stone that is too thin, spinning at speed under load, does not wear out gently. It fails. There are surviving accounts of runner stones bursting in mills, and there is a reason millers were traditionally paranoid about the sound of their own machinery. You worked all day standing next to a spinning object, weighing over a ton, that was slowly being sharpened into a weaker version of itself. Add all of it up. The weir, the leat, the pond, the foundations, the frame, the ironwork, the stones. In the 13th and 14th centuries, a substantial watermill cost, on the order of 10 to 20 pounds to build from nothing. against a craftsman's daily wage of threepence. That is somewhere between 800 and 1600 days of skilled labor. Roughly the same money as building a merchant's house for a machine that grinds barley. So far, so good. Now let's talk about what it actually earns, because this is where the whole thing turns into a different business than the one you signed up for. You do not get paid in money. You get paid in grain. A customer brings a sack, you grind it, and you keep a fixed fraction of what they brought. That fraction is called multure, and the rate varied enormously depending on where you were, and, more to the point, on who the customer was. At Langdon and Ambler's numbers, a free man might pay 1/24th, an unfree tenant on the same manor, grinding the same barley in the same building, might pay 1/13th. In parts of northern England and in Scotland, the rates ran considerably higher, and in some places as high as a third. Read those two numbers next to each other again. Same mill, same grain, same 15 minutes of the miller's attention. One customer pays roughly 4%, the other pays roughly 8%. The difference between them is not the service. It's a legal status recorded in a court roll 200 years earlier that tells you what you're actually selling, and it isn't grinding. Now, the mechanism. In much of medieval England, mills operated under a custom called suit of mill. If you lived on the manor and held land from the lord, you were legally obliged to bring your grain to the lord's mill, not encouraged. Obliged. Grinding your own grain at home was, in many places, a finable offense, and the tools for doing it were contraband. This is the thing people get wrong about the medieval watermill. It was not a technology business. The wheel and the stones are just the collection apparatus. The actual asset, the thing with value, is a line in a manorial court roll that says the people of this parish must come here, which raises the obvious question. If you own the most powerful legal monopoly on the manor, attached to the most expensive machine on the manor, why on earth would you hand it to a tenant? And this is where medieval landlords turn out to be considerably more modern than we give them credit for. Because look at the cost structure you're holding. Your revenue is a fraction of a harvest, which is set by the weather. Your costs are stones, ironwork, timber, millwrights' wages, and repairs to a wooden structure sitting in moving water. Those costs arrive whether the harvest comes in or not. Langdon's work on manorial accounts across more than 300 English manors produced one number that explains everything about how these mills were managed. On average, the cost of repairs on a medieval watermill equaled its entire original construction cost, roughly every 10 years. Sit with that for a second, because it's the whole business in one sentence. You are not maintaining an asset. You are rebuilding it, continuously, in fragments, forever. Over a 40-year holding period, you don't buy the mill once. You buy it 5 times. So what does a rational lord do with an asset that carries a legal monopoly, weather-dependent revenue, and a maintenance bill that consumes the capital value every decade? He keeps the monopoly and sells the risk. He leases the mill to a miller for a fixed annual rent. The miller pays the same number every year, regardless of the harvest, keeps whatever multure he can collect above it, and takes the volatility on his own back. The lord converts a violently unpredictable income stream into a fixed one, and never has to think about the weather again. And the entire commercial negotiation, the real substance of a medieval mill lease, comes down to one clause: who pays for the repairs? Because the rent is easy. Both sides know roughly what the mill earns. The fight is over which party is holding the bag when a flood takes the weir out in February. In some leases, the lord supplied the timber and the millstones, and the tenant did everything else. In others, the tenant carried the lot, and the split in that clause tells you exactly who had the leverage when the ink went on. In a way, the headline rent never does. If that structure sounds familiar, it should. It's the same shape as a franchise agreement. One party owns the brand and the territorial right. The other party puts up the working capital, does the labor, absorbs the bad years, and pays a fixed number upward regardless. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. A monopoly that people are legally required to use is only worth something if it can actually be enforced. And this one was very hard to enforce because the competition was a rock. A handmill, or quern, is two flat stones about the size of a dinner plate. You put grain between them, and you turn the top one with a wooden handle. It is slow. It is exhausting. It produces a coarser meal than a watermill, and it takes a woman most of an evening to do what a mill does in minutes. But it is free. It sits on your kitchen floor, and nobody sees you use it. So they used them, constantly. And a fifth of England's grain kept going through them for the entire period. Which means the mill owner is now in a business he never intended to be in. He is not competing on speed or on quality of flour. He is running an enforcement operation against his own tenants. Court rolls across England record the fines. They record the confiscations. They record stones seized from houses and broken. And this is where a mill stops being a piece of infrastructure and starts being something people hate, because the miller is right in the middle of it, and his position is structurally impossible. Geoffrey Chaucer gives us the popular verdict without any ambiguity. His miller in the Canterbury Tales is a thief who takes his toll 3 times over, and Chaucer jokes about the golden thumb, the miller's thumb resting on the scale. The whole tale, The Reeves, is built on students trying to catch a miller stealing their flour. The medieval miller was, by a wide margin, the most distrusted trade in Europe. Now, whether any given miller was actually stealing is almost beside the point. Look at the position he was put in. He was paid in a fraction of a quantity that nobody had measured, taken from a heap that nobody had weighed, inside a building that customers were not allowed to enter while the machinery was running, in exchange for a service that they were not legally permitted to refuse. There was no receipt. There was no scale. There was no alternative supplier to compare him against. Under those conditions, a man does not have to be a thief to be hated as one. The system was built in a way that made honesty unverifiable, and a business whose customers cannot verify honesty will eventually be treated as dishonest, whatever it actually does. Which brings us to a floor in Hertfordshire. In the 14th century, the Abbey of St. Albans held one of the largest and most tightly controlled estates in England, and its abbot for a period in the 1330s was Richard of Wallingford. He is remembered today mostly as a brilliant mathematician who built an astronomical clock that was centuries ahead of its time. He also won a long and bitter fight with the townspeople of St. Albans over their right to grind their own corn, and when he won it, he confiscated their hand mills. Then he had them set into the floor of the abbey's outer parlor as paving, so that every single person from the town who came to the abbey on business walked across their own confiscated millstones on the way in. That is not enforcement. Enforcement would have been a fine. That is a monument, laid at the entrance, designed to be walked on. It stayed there for around 50 years. Then in June of 1381, England rose. The peasants' revolt reached St. Albans on the 13th, led locally by a townsman named William Grindecob. The rebels burned the manorial records in the marketplace. They freed the prisoners from the abbot's gaol, and they went into the abbey and pulled up the floor. They took the stones out to the commons and broke them into fragments, and then they handed the fragments out to the townspeople. Thomas Walsingham, the abbey's own chronicler, watched this happen and left us the detail that makes the whole thing land. He wrote that the pieces were distributed as if they were the blessed bread handed out at Mass. He meant it as horror. He was recording an act of blasphemy, but he had accidentally written down the truest sentence anyone wrote about medieval milling. The people of St. Albans understood exactly what those stones were. They were the sacrament of the thing that had been done to them, and they took communion in it. Now here's the part that almost never gets told, and it's the reason this story belongs in a video about economics rather than a video about heroes. The abbot won. It took him about a month. The revolt collapsed nationally. Royal authority came back, and Richard II revoked every charter that had been extracted under duress. On the 12th of July, 1381, William Grindecob and the other townsmen were made to gather up every fragment they could find and carry 6 millstones back to the abbey. And that evening, with the help of the same townsmen who had torn them out, the stones were set back down into the parlor floor. Rindcob was executed. Keep that in mind, because it tells you something about what kind of asset this actually was. The mill itself was never the point. Nobody burned the mill. They went for the floor. The thing the town wanted destroyed was not a machine, it was a claim. And a claim cannot be smashed with a hammer because it doesn't live in the object. It lives in whoever has the power to enforce it. The stones went back down because the enforcement never left. So, let's do the arithmetic and see what all of this was actually worth. The core engine is simple. Your revenue is the total grain milled multiplied by your multure rate. Nothing else. Say you hold a decent demesne mill serving a manor of a few hundred people, and your customers are a mix of free and unfree tenants, so your effective toll averages out somewhere around 1/15 of everything that comes through the door. The mill runs hardest from the autumn harvest through the winter, slows in the spring as stores run down, and does very little in late summer when last year's grain is gone, and this year's is still standing in the field. Against that you are carrying rent or opportunity cost on the site. The millwright's visits to dress the stones, ironwork from the smith, timber repairs, and a sinking fund for the next pair of stones. And Langdon's finding sits underneath all of it. Over 10 years, your repairs cost you what the whole mill cost to build. Domesday gives us a sense of the range. Most mills were recorded as rendering somewhere in the order of shillings per year, not pounds. The outliers were spectacular. The manor of Battersea on the River Wandle was recorded with 8 watermills valued together at over £42 a year, the highest mill valuation in the entire survey. But that is the exception that tells you the rule. 8 mills on an unusually good stretch of river next to London. Your mill is not Battersea. Your mill renders a few shillings to a couple of pounds a year, and needs a pair of stones costing a meaningful fraction of that, which means the break-even question for a medieval mill is not really about volume at all. Volume is fixed. The village eats what the village eats, and no amount of marketing makes them eat more bread. There is no growth curve here. Your addressable market is the number of households within walking distance carrying a sack, and that number is set by the last harvest and the last outbreak of plague. So the mill has no upside. It has a ceiling set by biology and a floor set by the weather. That is a genuinely strange asset to own, and it is exactly why lords leased them out, and exactly why, when the tenants had leverage, the leases got very hard to fill. Now let's run 2 years, because the gap between them is the entire risk of this business. The good year, a wet spring fills the pond, and the leat runs strong through May. The summer is even, no long drought, so the wheel keeps turning through the quiet months on stored water. The harvest is heavy, so there is more grain coming through the door, and your fraction of it is larger in absolute terms. You dress the stones twice, and neither needs replacing. The weir holds. You pay your rent, you cover the smith, and you keep a surplus. On a good mill, in a good year, that surplus is real money. Not fortune money, comfortable money. Now the bad year. February brings a flood, and the weir goes. That is not a repair, that is a rebuild. And until it is done, the mill produces nothing at all. Then the summer runs dry, and the pond drops below working level, so the wheel stands still for 6 weeks in the middle of the season. In August, the runner stone finally goes too thin and cracks. So you send to Southampton for a new one at a price that has doubled since your father bought the last pair. And here is the cruel part, the thing that makes this business genuinely dangerous rather than merely difficult. The harvest is bad too, because the same drought that stopped your wheel also stunted the crop. So in the year when your costs spike, there is less grain in the parish to take a fraction of. And your revenue, remember, is a fraction of a physical quantity of grain, not a fraction of its value. Grain prices go through the roof in a famine year. Your income does the opposite, because 1/15 of a small harvest is a small amount of grain, no matter what a bushel is worth in town. The mill fails at exactly the moment the parish is starving. That is not bad luck. That is built into the shape of the contract. The gap between those 2 years, on the same building, on the same river, with the same customers, can be the difference between a comfortable tenancy and a man walking away from a lease he cannot pay. And that is what eventually happened, at scale. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348 and killed a huge share of the population inside 2 years. Now think about what that does to a business whose entire revenue is a fraction of what a fixed number of people eat. Fewer people is fewer sacks. Fewer sacks is less mulcher. And the fixed costs, the stones, the smith, the timber, the weir, do not shrink by a third because your parish did. Mill numbers across England dropped by roughly 10% in the decades right after the plague. Then, across the following century and a half, they dropped by roughly another 10% as mills that could not carry their own maintenance were simply abandoned. Not dramatically. No fires, no revolts. A weir went out, and nobody could make the arithmetic work for rebuilding it. So the leat silted up, and the frame rotted, and the site went quiet. But the deeper change was in the leverage. With fewer tenants and more empty land, an ordinary peasant suddenly had options. He could move. He could hold out for a better tenancy elsewhere. And a legal obligation is only as strong as your willingness to lose a tenant over it. Suit of Mill did not get repealed in a dramatic moment. It got quietly harder to enforce, manor by manor, because the cost of enforcing it went up, and the cost of losing the man went up faster. The monopoly did not break. It just stopped being worth what it cost to defend. And the mills that survived the whole thing are the ones that had stopped depending on it. Because the same wheel that turns a millstone will turn anything. Through the later Middle Ages, mills across England and Europe were converted to fulling, pounding woolen cloth with wooden hammers, which was a growth industry when bread grain was not. Others went to malt for brewing. Others to driving hammers and bellows for ironworking. Sawmills. Later, paper. Those conversions were not nostalgic. They were a business decision, and the logic is the same one you'd make today. A corn mill sells a legally compelled service to a shrinking population at a fixed toll. A fulling mill sells a genuinely useful process into an export trade, with actual demand growth. By the 16th century, mills were increasingly being bought by merchants and gentry investors, and leased out to operators. And those buyers had no manorial power to compel anybody to use anything. They were buying the mill for what it produced, not for who it could force, which is a completely different asset than the one the abbot of St. Albans thought he was defending with his parlor floor. So, does owning a medieval watermill work? It works as long as one specific condition holds. Not the river, not the stones, not the harvest. The condition is that somebody with power is willing to punish the woman on the kitchen floor with the hand mill. Everything else about this business is ordinary. Capital costs, maintenance, weather risk, thin margins, leasing to transfer volatility. Any of that could be a modern business. The part that made the medieval mill exceptional was never the technology. Rome had watermills. The engineering was 1,000 years old. What was new was the law that sat on top of it. And that's the thing about the wheel and the water and the great stone turning in the dark. All of it looking like the river doing your work for you. It was never the river doing the work. You were never buying a machine. You were buying the right to stand between a village and its bread. And when that right stopped being enforceable, the most valuable building in the parish became a shed on a stream. Production notes. Visual keyword density. Strong. Restored working watermills. Wheels in the race. Water over a weir. Millstones in the furrow pattern. A quern turning on a stone floor. The Domesday Book manuscript. St. Albans Abbey and its gatehouse. Mill ponds at dawn. A blacksmith forging a spindle. This topic passes the B-roll availability test better than most medieval subjects because working mills survive across Europe. Numbers are written as words throughout for TTS. Do not convert 4 pence back to 4 days, or 1086 to 1086. 0 M dashes, 0 brackets, 0 timestamps, verified, colons used, 0 in narration, hinge phrases placed at. Here's the problem. Hook. So far so good. Now let's talk about tilde 28%. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. Tilde 52%. Keep that in mind, because tilde 68%. And here is the cruel part. Tilde 82%. Darkness ladder rungs. In order. Cost. The stones eat themselves. Paid in an unmeasured fraction. Paid more if you're unfree. Grinding at home is a crime. The miller cannot prove honesty. The confiscated stones become a floor. The floor is torn up. The floor is put back, and the leader is hanged. No CTA. Ends on the inversion, matching the reference scripts. If you want a subscribe line, put it after the final sentence, never before it. Sources behind the load-bearing numbers. Domesday mill counts and Battersea valuation from the Domesday Survey. Mill totals and sector split from John Langdon. Mills in the Medieval Economy. England 1300 to 1540. The 10-year repair equals build figure from the same. Multure rates from Langdon and from Ambler's work on domestic milling. Millstone price movement from David Farmer. Millstones for medieval manners. Agricultural History Review. The St. Albans events from Thomas Walsingham's Chronicle via the Gesta Abbotum. Wage and price anchors from Christopher Dyer. Standards of living in the later Middle Ages. One honest caveat worth knowing. Mark Bloch's classic 1935 argument was that mills were adopted mainly as instruments of seigneurial extraction. Langdon's later work pushes back, finding real competition between mills and generally low charges outside northern England. This script leans toward the coercion reading, because that's where the story is, but it stays factually defensible by attributing the harshest rates to where they actually occurred, rather than claiming they were universal.